Welcome to this series entitled Creative Aging, the spiritual practice of growing older with God. Each week I'm going to be with you in your group, and that is a privilege that you've given me, and I hope that each input each week will add something special to the conversations that you have with each other. I want to begin simply by saying something that's very obvious. Aging is part of life. It's a deep reality that all of us have got to come to terms with. And I think that's why the psalmist in that beautiful psalm, Psalm 90, verse 12, he prays, "Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a wise heart." And I hope that you're going to memorize that verse from Psalm 90. Lord, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a wise heart. I can pinpoint the moment, the moment I realized I was getting older. I think I just turned 40. I was watching a test match at a Centurion in Pretoria, and a young boy came across to me. He must have been about 8 or 9 years of age, and he called me Oom. And I realized in that moment that I was no longer a young man. I remember birthdays, when I turned 20, I kind of thought that I would reach 40. When I turned 30, I hoped I would reach 60. When I turned 40, I began to pray that I would make 80. When I turned 50, I realized I had a very slim chance of making 100. But when I turned 60, I knew that I had gone over the halfway mark, that I was now in that stage of life that I wasn't going to pass through, I was just going to pass on. You kind of pass through adolescence, you pass through middle age, but I'm in that stage of life now where I won't pass through, I'm going to pass on. We live in a culture that doesn't encourage us to face the reality of getting older. On the one hand, our culture often encourages us to defy the reality of aging. We have a massive anti-aging industry. Nothing wrong with it. It's done some wonderful research. It offers some good products. It helps us to maybe stay younger on the inside of our life. But we cannot defy the reality of aging. Sometimes I think I am defying it. The other day I did my fastest park run ever. And I came home and I said to Debbie, you won't believe it, but I've just done the fastest park run that I've ever done in my life. And I kind of thought to myself, maybe I'm defying getting older, but that's an illusion. The reality is, for myself and for you, is that we are getting older, and it's a reality that we cannot defy. On the other hand, our culture sometimes encourages us to deny the reality that we're getting older. It's not a subject that we talk about too easily. Maybe one of the reasons for our reluctance to talk about aging is because it reminds us of the reality of death. Every passing hour, I am 1 hour closer to my own death. And death is a little bit of a kind of taboo subject. You know, if you're kind of standing around the braai, having a beer, eating meat, and some good chops and wors, you're not going to begin to speak about death. It sounds a little bit morbid. And yet, you know, some of the great spiritual giants over the ages have always encouraged us, I think very wisely, to keep the reality of death before us all the time. The reality of death reminds us of the preciousness of every moment that we have on this earth. It reminds us of the sacredness of this moment that we have it right now. It's unrepeatable. We're never going to have it again. And it just keeps us on our toes, never to take our lives for granted. So the question that I want us to explore a bit is, how do we move beyond defiance and denial of aging? How do we begin to face the reality of our age, and that we are, in fact, getting older? And I want to just share a few very simple thoughts with you that I hope will facilitate a lot of good conversation and discussion in your group. The first thought I want to share with you is this, that we begin to move beyond denial, beyond defiance, when we are willing to share honestly how we feel about getting older. What do we think about it? And are we willing to be honest about our thoughts and feelings? You know, so often within church settings and church groups, we often pretend. I often like to say to the congregations where I've ministered that very often church is the most dishonest place in town. And we kind of, you know, we say the correct things, what we think the right things are. Can I just encourage you, just to be honest? What do you think? How do you feel about getting older? And I think something very special happens when we are willing to become real in a group around our thoughts and our feelings. My second thought that I want to share with you is this, is that we begin to move beyond denial, beyond defiance, when we realize that the God that we worship meets us where we are. That God meets us in the reality of our life. I often like to say that reality is God's home address. It's where God meets us. You know, God is not the great I was. God is the great I am. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And so wherever we happen to be at the moment, whatever stage of life, whatever age, whatever the reality is, God wants to meet us in our reality. And I'm hoping that over these next few weeks, we're going to be able to move away from our illusions about life into the realities of life, because that is where God meets us. The last thought that I want to share with you is, I think we move beyond defiance, beyond denial of aging, when we ask God for the grace for us to accept the wrinkles of our aging. You know, so often we struggle to live in the present moment. And especially as we get older, you know, we sometimes live in the past, or we kind of are always ruminating and thinking about the future, worrying about the future, anxious about the future, nostalgic about the past. And we miss out on living in the present moment, right now. And I want to invite you, as I invite myself, to ask God, Lord, will you give me the grace that I need, the courage that I need to really live in this moment now? One of the things that I love to say to God is, Lord, will you help me to live in this present moment now? Will you help me to live it very deeply, fully, richly? Will you help me to keep growing now? Will you help me to stay on the creative edge now? Will you help me to deepen my relationship with you now? Will you help me to keep taking risks for you now? Will you help me to keep living with a sense of adventure now, in this moment, right now, right here? So those are the thoughts I want to share with you. And my own prayer is that somehow, through what I've said, God will speak to you, touch your life, and above all, help you and help me, myself, to really face reality, to move beyond defiance of reality, denial of reality, because it's in reality that God meets us and encounters us. So God bless you, and I'll be with you again next week.